He unified a nation, built the greatest army the world had ever seen, and constructed walls that would outlast empires. But there was one enemy he could not defeat: time itself. So he declared war on death, and what he did next changed history. Forever. There is a room you will enter one day. You don't know where it is. You don't know when you'll find it. But somewhere, in some hospital, some battlefield, some ordinary bedroom on some ordinary night, there is a room waiting for you. And in that room, everything you've ever loved, everything you've ever built, everything you've ever dreamed will become irrelevant. In that room, you will meet the only enemy that has never been defeated. Death. It doesn't care about your money. It doesn't care about your power. It doesn't care about your legacy, your children, your unfinished business, or your desperate prayers. For 4 billion years, since the first cell divided in some primordial ocean, death has collected every single life that ever existed. Every dinosaur, every emperor, every saint, every monster, every genius who ever lived. The collection rate is 100%. And here's the strange part. Here's the part that has haunted humanity since we first became conscious enough to understand our own fate. We know this. We've always known this. Every single human being who has ever lived has understood, somewhere deep in their bones, that their time is borrowed, and yet we refuse to accept it. Think about that for a moment. Think about the sheer, magnificent arrogance of the human spirit. We know we're going to die. The evidence is everywhere. We watch our grandparents fade. We bury our friends. We pass graveyards on our way to work, filled with people who once had plans for the weekend, and still something inside us whispers, but not me. Maybe not me. This isn't weakness. This isn't stupidity. This is the engine that builds civilization. Because here's what nobody talks about when they discuss the great monuments of human history: the pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, the hanging gardens and golden temples and magnificent tombs that still take our breath away thousands of years later. These weren't just expressions of power or wealth or artistic vision. They were expressions of terror. They were built by people, often very powerful people, who lay awake at night with the same fear that sometimes grips you at 3 a.m. That cold, creeping awareness that everything ends. That one day you simply won't exist anymore. And they built their monuments to scream into the void. I was here. I mattered. Remember me. But some of them wanted more than memory. Some of them wanted to cheat. The fascinating thing about human history is that the people who feared death most weren't the poor, the powerless, or the suffering. They weren't the slaves building the pyramids under the Egyptian sun, or the peasants starving through another failed harvest. No, the people most terrified of dying were the ones who had conquered everything else. The kings, the emperors, the pharaohs, the supreme rulers who commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Men who could order cities burned and populations enslaved with a wave of their hand. Men who had achieved everything the human experience could possibly offer: wealth, power, pleasure, glory, and they discovered something terrible. None of it was enough, because what good is owning half the known world if you're going to die? Just like the servant who empties your chamber pot. What good is having 10,000 concubines if your body will rot just like the beggar in the street? What good is building palaces that would make the gods jealous if you'll never see them again after your last breath? Power, it turns out, has a horrifying side effect. It teaches you what you have to lose. A peasant might accept death as release from a hard life. But an emperor has tasted everything life has to offer. He has experienced pleasures most humans can't even imagine. He has held the fate of nations in his hands. He has been worshipped as a living god, and now he's supposed to just ... give that up. Disappear into the darkness like everyone else. The powerful don't accept this easily. They never have. Travel with me now across the ancient world. Not to see its wonders, but to see its obsessions. Start in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humanity first began writing down its stories. And what was the oldest story they chose to tell? The Epic of Gilgamesh. A tale written nearly 4,000 years ago about a king so shattered by his best friend's death that he traveled to the ends of the earth searching for eternal life. Gilgamesh fought monsters. He crossed oceans no human had crossed before. He found a plant at the bottom of the sea that could restore youth, and then he lost it. A serpent stole it while he slept. The very first great story humanity ever wrote was about the desperate search for immortality, and its failure now. Travel west to Egypt. For 3,000 years, the most advanced civilization on Earth dedicated an almost unimaginable amount of its resources to one goal: defeating death. The pyramids weren't just tombs, they were resurrection machines. The Egyptians believed that if they could preserve the body perfectly, if they could include the right spells and the right provisions, the deceased could live forever in the afterlife. They removed organs and stored them in sacred jars. They wrapped bodies in linen and filled them with preservatives. They built structures so massive they would last until the end of time itself. All because they could not accept that death was final. Travel east to India, where sages spent lifetimes searching for Amrita, the nectar of immortality. The gods themselves had churned a cosmic ocean to produce this divine substance. Surely, if humans could find it, they too could escape the cycle of death and rebirth during Greece. Philosophers told stories of ambrosia, the food of the Olympian gods that granted eternal life. They whispered about the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by a dragon that never slept. They dreamed of fountains whose waters could reverse age itself. Every civilization, every culture, every empire, the story was always the same. Death is coming. There must be a way out. But there was one civilization that took this obsession further than any other. One empire that didn't just build tombs and tell stories, but actually devoted the full resources of the most powerful state on earth to finding real, physical, scientific immortality. And at the center of this empire was a single man. He was born into a world of blood. The Warring States period of ancient China was an era of slaughter almost incomprehensible to modern minds. For over 2 centuries, 7 kingdoms had been locked in constant, brutal warfare. Millions died, cities were erased, entire populations were massacred after battles, sometimes 400,000 prisoners executed in a single day. This was the world that forged him by the time he was 39 years old. This man had accomplished something no one in Chinese history had ever achieved. Through a combination of brilliant strategy, ruthless efficiency, and almost supernatural determination, he had conquered all 6 rival kingdoms. He had unified China for the first time in history under a single rule. He commanded an empire of over 40 million people. He'd built walls that stretched across mountains. He standardized language, currency, weights and measures across a landmass larger than Western Europe. He was, by any objective measurement, the most powerful human being who had ever lived up to that point in history, and he was absolutely, completely, utterly terrified of dying. Not just worried about it, not just uncomfortable with the concept, terrified in a way that consumed his every waking moment. Terrified in a way that made him see assassins around every corner. Terrified in a way that drove him to sleep in a different palace room every single night so no one could find him. This man didn't want to be remembered after death. He didn't want a glorious afterlife. He didn't want his legacy to live on through his children. He wanted to never die at all. And unlike all the kings and pharaohs before him, he actually tried to make it happen. He sent expeditions to the eddies of the known world, searching for magical islands where immortals lived. He built laboratories where alchemists worked day and night to create an elixir that could grant eternal life. He consulted with mystics and magicians, astrologers and priests. He swallowed potions containing the most toxic substances known to man: mercury, arsenic, lead. All in the desperate hope that one of them would be the key to living forever. And here's the terrible irony, the cruel joke that history played on this extraordinary man. The very potions he took to escape death almost certainly killed him. The conqueror who unified the largest empire on earth was slowly poisoning himself, convinced he was on the path to immortality. The man who feared death more than anyone in history practically ran into its arms. But who was this man, really? How did he go from a child hostage in an enemy kingdom to the most powerful ruler the world had ever seen? What happened in his life that made him so desperate to escape death that he would risk everything, even life itself, to find a way out? And how did his obsession with immortality lead him to create wonders that would actually last forever, while his empire crumbled just 4 years after his death? This is the story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who conquered everything except the one enemy that mattered. This is the story of what happens when unlimited power meets unavoidable mortality. And it begins, as all the greatest stories do, with blood. The year was 259 BCE. In the state of Zhao, in a city called Handan, a woman was screaming. She was young, beautiful, and very far from home. Around her, midwives worked frantically while guards stood watch outside the door. Because this was no ordinary birth. This was a political event. The woman was a concubine. The child she was delivering would either be a valuable bargaining chip or a death sentence, depending on how the winds of war shifted in the coming months. She had been sent here as part of a hostage exchange, a human guarantee that the state of Qin would honor its treaty with Zhao when the baby finally emerged. Red-faced and screaming, no one could have predicted what he would become. They named him Yingzhang. One day, he would be called Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who would unify China, build the Great Wall, and create an empire that would shape the next 2,000 years of human history. But on that day, he was just a hostage's child, born into a world that wanted him dead. To understand the man Yingzhang would become, you must first understand the world he was born into. The Warring States period of Chinese history was not like other eras of conflict. This wasn't a civil war or a succession crisis. This was 2.5 centuries of almost continuous, industrialized slaughter. 7 major kingdoms, Shaohan, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi fought constantly for supremacy. And when we say fought, we mean something almost unimaginable by modern standards. In 260 BC, just 1 year before Ying, Zheng was born. The kingdom of Qin defeated the kingdom of Shao at the Battle of Chengping. The Qin general, a man named Bai Qi, took approximately 400,000 Zhao prisoners of war. He executed all of them, not in battle, not in self-defense. He simply had 400,000 human beings put to death because feeding them would be expensive and releasing them would be dangerous. This was the world Yingzhen entered. A world where human life had no value beyond its strategic utility. A world where entire cities were erased from existence if they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. A world where a child born in enemy territory could be killed at any moment if political calculations shifted. His earliest memories would have been of fear. Imagine being 6 years old and understanding that people want to murder you, not because of anything you've done, not because you're cruel or dangerous or threatening, simply because of who your father is, simply because killing you would send a message to the state of Qin. This was Yingzhang's childhood. He and his mother lived in Handan as hostages, theoretically protected by diplomatic agreements, but practically vulnerable to any shift in the political winds. When he was 3 years old, Qin attacked Shao. The agreement that kept him alive suddenly became worthless. The Shao government debated killing him. Think about that. At 3 years old, a committee of politicians sat in a room and discussed whether to murder him to punish his homeland. His survival came down to one Merton, man named El Bue, who bribed the right officials and smuggled the child and his mother out of the city. Hidden in a merchant caravan, Yingzhang learned something in those early years that would shape everything he did afterward. He learned that the world was not safe. He learned that people smiled at you while plotting your death. He learned that treaties and agreements were worthless the moment they became inconvenient. He learned that trust was suicide. But here's where the story gets complicated. Here's where we enter the realm of scandal, conspiracy, and questions that historians still debate today. Who was Yingzhang's real father? The official story is straightforward. His father was Prince Yaran of Qin, a minor royal who had been sent to Zhao as a hostage. His mother was a beautiful concubine named Lady Zhaoel. Bue was simply a merchant who saw an opportunity to gain favor with the Qin royal family by helping them escape. But there was another story. A darker story. One that was whispered in corridors and written down by historians just a few decades after these events. According to this version, El Bue wasn't just a helpful merchant. He was a master manipulator, playing the longest game in Chinese history. The story goes like this. El Bue acquired Lady Shao as his own concubine first. He recognized her extraordinary beauty and intelligence, and he had a plan. He deliberately introduced her to Prince Yaran, knowing the prince would become infatuated. He then generously gave her to the prince as a gift. But here's the key detail. According to the historian Sima Qian, Lady Zhao was already pregnant with El Bue's child when this transfer happened, which would mean Yingzheng, future first emperor of China, was not actually of royal blood at all. He was the illegitimate son of a merchant who had schemed his way into the royal family. Is this true? We'll probably never know for certain. Ancient historians had their own agendas, and rumors about illegitimate births were common weapons in political disputes. But what matters is that Yingzheng almost certainly heard these whispers. He grew up knowing that some people questioned whether he had any right to the throne at all. Another layer of insecurity, another reason to trust no one. In 251 BCE, when Yingzheng was 8 years old, everything changed. His grandfather, King Zhaoshong of Qin, finally died after an extraordinarily long reign. Yingzhen's father, now free from his hostage status, was summoned back to Qin. He brought his family with him. For the first time in his life, Yingzheng was home, but the respite was brief. His father became king but died after only 3 years. On the throne, some suspected poison, though nothing was ever proven. Suddenly, at 13 years old, Yingzheng was king of Qin. On paper, this was an extraordinary elevation. In reality, it was a new kind of prison, because a 13-year-old king is a puppet king, Elbue, that same merchant who may or may not have been. Yingzheng's biological father was appointed regent. He held all the actual power. The young king sat on the throne, wore the robes, performed the ceremonies. But Elbue made the decisions. And Elbue was not the only problem. There was also the matter of Yingzhen's mother. Lady Zhao had been transferred from man to man since her youth from Elbue to Prince Yaran, now widowed. Still young, still beautiful, she was isolated and frustrated. She began an affair. His name was Laoe, and officially he was a servant. In reality, he was Lady Zhao's lover, smuggled into the palace by Elbue himself, possibly as a way to distract the Queen Mother while he consolidated power. The affair was an open secret at court. Lady Zhao even had 2 children with Lao. AI, half-brothers to the king that everyone pretended didn't exist. Imagine being 15 years old. Imagine sitting on the most powerful throne in the known world, but having no actual power. Imagine knowing that your regent might be your real father, that your mother is publicly conducting an affair with a servant, and that both of them are probably plotting to keep you powerless forever. Imagine the rage building inside you, year after year, with no outlet. In 238 BCE, the explosion finally came. Yingzheng was 22 years old. Lao Ia, grown arrogant from his influence over the Queen Mother, attempted a coup. He forged the royal seal, called up troops, and tried to seize the palace while the young king was away at a ceremony. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Yingzheng had been waiting for this moment. He had been preparing for it. He had been building his own network of loyal followers, his own intelligence system, his own understanding of who could be trusted and who would need to be eliminated. He crushed the rebellion with terrifying efficiency. Lao AI was captured, tied to chariots, and ripped apart. His entire clan was executed 3 generations, down to the last child. The 2 half-brothers, Yingzheng's mothers, children with Lao AI, were put in sacks and beaten to death. The Queen Mother herself was spared, but barely. Yingzheng initially wanted to kill her too. It took 27 advisors speaking against the plan. The first 26 were executed for their objections before he finally relented and simply banished her from the capital. And then he turned his attention to Elbue, the merchant who had once saved his life, who might have been his biological father, was stripped of his titles and exiled. A year later, facing the prospect of being brought back for trial, El Bouet drank poison and died. In a single year, Yingzhang had eliminated everyone who had controlled him since childhood. He was finally, truly, the ruler of Qin. He was 22 years old, and he was just getting started. But the trauma wasn't over. The universe, it seemed, wasn't done teaching Yingzhang that death was always close. In 227 BCE, a man named Jing Kai walked into the Qin throne room carrying a map and a box. He claimed to be an ambassador from the state of Yan, bringing gifts of submission. The map concealed a poised dagger. The box contained the severed head of a Qin general who had defected to Yan. As Jing Kai unrolled the map and revealed the hidden weapon, time seemed to slow. The assassin lunged for the king. Yingzhang leaped backward, scrambling away from the blade. Guards stood frozen by law. They couldn't enter the throne room with weapons without explicit permission. The king grabbed a decorative pillar, circling it desperately while the assassin slashed at him. His sword was too long to draw quickly in the confined space. Ministers screamed. The assassin's blade caught the king's sleeve, cutting the fabric. Inches from death. Maybe less. Finally, a court physician threw his medicine bag at Jing Kai, momentarily distracting him. Yingzhang managed to draw his sword and struck the assassin's thigh. As Jing Kai fell, he hurled the poisoned dagger at the king. It missed. The guards finally rushed in and cut Jing Kai to pieces. Yingzhang stood in his throne room, surrounded by blood, heart pounding, robes torn, alive by the margin of a few inches and a physician's quick thinking. This was not the first assassination attempt. It would not be the last. But something changed in him after that day. The paranoia that had always simmered beneath the surface became something more consuming. He began sleeping in different palaces every night. He had secret passages built. Throughout his residences, he traveled incognito, never announcing his movements. Death had brushed past him again, and again, and again. Each time, it came closer. But while Yingzhang was surviving assassination attempts, he was also building something unprecedented. One by one, the 6 rival kingdoms fell. Han conquered in 230 BCE Zhao, the state that had once held him hostage, that had debated murdering him as a child. He destroyed in 228 BCE Wei in 225 CHU. The largest and most powerful rival fell in 223, Yan in 222, and finally, Qi in 2-1. In less than a decade, Yingzhang had done what no one in Chinese history had ever accomplished. He had unified the entire realm under a single rule, and he decided he needed a new title. The old word for King Wang wasn't sufficient anymore. He was more than a king. He was something that had never existed before. He combined the words for the legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors of Chinese mythology, Huangdi, Emperor. But even that wasn't enough. He added one more qualifier. Shi first, Qin Shi Huangdi first, Emperor of Qin. The title implied that there would be a second, a third, a 10th, 100th an eternal dynasty stretching into forever. He was 38 years old. He ruled 40 million people. He commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. He had built walls across mountains and roads across plains. He had standardized everything from the written language to the width of cart axles. He stood at the absolute peak of human power, and that's when he looked around and realized something terrifying. He was going to die, all of it, the palace, the empire, the armies. The power would pass to someone else. His body would rot in the ground. His consciousness would dissolve into nothingness. Everything he had built, everything he had suffered for, everything he had killed for, would continue without him. He was 40 million people's guard, and he was still going to end up exactly like the slaves who built his roads. No, absolutely not. If he could conquer 6 kingdoms, he could conquer death. And so the most powerful man in the world declared war on the only enemy that had never been defeated. A war that would consume his remaining years, poison his body, and ultimately create one of history's greatest ironies. The man who feared death more than anything would chase it straight into his own grave. There is a moment that changes everything. For some people, it's a diagnosis. For others, it's a funeral. For many, it's simply lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, suddenly understanding with perfect clarity that one day they will no longer exist. For Qin Shi Huang, we don't know exactly when that moment came, but we know what happened afterward. The most powerful man in the world stopped looking outward at kingdoms to conquer. He started looking inward at the enemy he couldn't defeat, and then he started looking everywhere to the edges of the known world and beyond for someone, anyone who could tell him how to live forever. The conqueror became a seeker, and the seeking would consume everything. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the years immediately following unification, Qin Shi Huang was busy, monumentally busy. He was building roads that stretched thousands of miles. He was connecting and expanding the walls that would become the Great Wall. He was standardizing the written language, the currency, the legal system. He was burning books he considered dangerous and executing scholars who disagreed with him. He was building an empire designed to last 10,000 generations. But somewhere in the midst of all this construction, a terrible thought began to intrude. He would supervise the building of a new palace, and he would think, I will never see this completed. He would plan a road that would take decades to finish, and he would realize, I will be dead before the first cart travels its full length. The empire would endure. He would not. And for a man who had spent his entire life conquering obstacles, this was intolerable. So he did what he had always done when faced with a problem. He threw resources at it. He summoned experts. He demanded solutions. The difference was that this time, the problem was death itself. Enter the Fanjishai. In ancient China, the Fanji occupied a strange space between priest, scientist, and con artist. The word roughly translates to masters of methods or recipe gentlemen, but that doesn't capture what they really were. They were the keepers of secrets. Some Fanji specialized in divination, reading the future in turtle, shells, and yarrow. Storks. Others claimed expertise in astronomy, medicine, or geography. But the most prestigious, the most sought after, were those who claimed knowledge of the ultimate secret, how to become immortal. These were not humble men. They spoke with absolute confidence about things no living person could verify. They claimed to have visited islands where immortals lived. They described elixirs that could reverse aging, pills that could grant eternal life, techniques that could transform a mortal body into something that would never decay. And they had exactly what Qin Shi Huang needed: hope. Before we judge the emperor too harshly for believing them, consider this. The Fangxi weren't obviously fraudulent in the way a modern con artist might be. They operated within a sophisticated cosmological system that made internal sense. They had theories about how the universe worked, about the flow of qi, about the relationship between heaven and earth. They weren't making things up at random. They were wrong, but they were systematically wrong, in ways that were very difficult to disprove. And they had one tremendous advantage. No one could prove them wrong until it was too late. To understand why Qin Shi Huang believed in immortality, you have to understand what immortality meant in ancient Chinese thought. The Xian dot in Chinese mythology. Xian were not gods exactly. They were humans who had transcended the limitations of mortal existence through various means spiritual cultivation. Magical elixirs, divine favor, they had achieved a state of eternal life. And crucially, they were not just spiritual beings. They had bodies, they ate and drank, they lived in specific places. They could, theoretically, be found. The stories about Xian were vivid and detailed. They lived for thousands of years. They could fly through the air, walk through walls, transform their appearance at will. Some rode dragons. Others controlled the weather. They had transcended aging, sickness, and death while remaining recognizably human. This wasn't abstract theology. This was, to the ancient Chinese mind, natural history. The Xian were real. They existed. The question was simply how to find them and learn their secrets. And the Fangxi claimed to know where they lived, far to the east beyond the shores of China, across the treacherous waters of the sea. There were islands, 3 islands, according to the legends Pengli Fangzhang, Yngzhou. These were not ordinary islands. They were paradise realms where the Xian made their homes. The palaces there were made of gold and silver. The birds and animals were pure white. The trees bore fruits that granted eternal life to anyone who ate them. There was no sickness. There was no aging. There was no death. The islands floated on the sea, perpetually shrouded in mist. They could be glimpsed from a distance, but never approached. Ships that sailed toward them were always blown back by divine winds. The Xian, it seemed, did not welcome uninvited visitors, but the Fangxi insisted there was a way. If the right person came, with the right offerings, with the right purity of purpose, the islands would reveal themselves. The immortals would share their secrets. They just needed resources, ships, supplies, young people uncorrupted by the world's pollution. And they knew exactly who had those resources. In 219 BCE, a man named Su Fu knelt before the emperor. He was a Fangxi from the coastal region of Qi, and he came with an extraordinary proposal. He claimed to have seen the islands of the immortals. He claimed to know the route. He claimed that if given the proper support, he could sail there and return with the elixir of eternal life. What did he need? 3,000 virgin boys and girls, the finest ships in the empire, supplies for a voyage of indefinite length, craftsmen to build whatever the immortals might request in exchange for their secrets, treasures to present as gifts. It was an enormous request. The cost would be staggering. The logistics alone would require redirecting significant imperial resources. Qin Shi Huang approved it immediately. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful, most paranoid, most ruthless ruler in the world, heard a stranger's incredible claims and said yes. He didn't demand proof. He didn't wait to verify the story. He simply handed over thousands of children and a fortune in resources to a man he had never met before. What does that tell you about his desperation? Su Fu sailed east with his fleet of ships and his cargo of 3,000 young people. The emperor waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. Su Fu didn't return. We'll explore what actually happened to him in a later chapter. But for now, consider the emperor's position. He had invested enormously in this expedition. He had allowed himself to hope. And now, nothing. Silence. Empty horizon. A rational person might have concluded that the Fangshi were frauds, that the islands didn't exist, that immortality was a fantasy. Qin Shi Huang concluded something different. The expedition had failed because something was done wrong. The approach wasn't correct. The offerings weren't sufficient. The seekers weren't pure enough. The immortals were testing him, and he needed to try harder. This is the psychology of desperate belief. When evidence contradicts hope, the believer doesn't abandon hope. Instead, they find reasons why this particular failure doesn't invalidate the underlying belief. The theory is never wrong. Only the execution is wrong. So the emperor sent more expeditions. Different Fangshi, different routes, different offerings. Each one failed. Each failure was explained away with new theories, new requirements, new demands. Maybe the immortals wanted jade. Maybe they needed specific prayers. Maybe the previous seekers had harbored impure thoughts. Maybe. The answer was, always try again. Spend more. Send more. Never. Perhaps this is impossible. The Fangshi, of course, understood exactly what they were dealing with. They had found the ultimate mark. A man with unlimited resources, desperate need, and an inability to accept failure. A man who would execute you for disappointing him, but also reward you beyond imagination for giving him hope. A man who wanted something that didn't exist, but would pay any price for the promise of it. Some of them were true believers themselves. They had been raised in traditions that accepted the reality of immortals and magic islands. They genuinely thought their methods might work. Others were pure opportunists. They saw a chance to extract wealth and status from a powerful fool, and they took it. Most, probably, were somewhere in between. They believed enough to keep trying, doubted enough to keep demanding more resources before attempting anything definitive. And all of them knew the cardinal rule. Never say it's impossible. Always leave hope alive. Always have an explanation. For failure that doesn't implicate them away. Fundamental premise. Because the moment you admitted that immortality couldn't be achieved, you became useless. And useless people in Qin Shi Huang's court had very short lifespans. But here's what's truly fascinating about this period. Qin Shi Huang was not a stupid man. He had unified China through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and administrative brilliance. He had outmaneuvered rivals who had been scheming since before he was born. He had survived assassination attempts through quick thinking and careful planning. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most intelligent and capable rulers in human history. And yet he believed the Fanj Das. How is this possible? The answer: lies in understanding that intelligence and rationality are not the same thing. Brilliant people can believe irrational things when those things address deep emotional needs. The greater the need, the more the mind bends to accommodate belief. Qin Shi Huang needed immortality to be possible, not wanted, needed. His entire psychological structure depended on it. The alternative accepting that he would die like everyone else was literally unthinkable. And when something is unthinkable, the mind simply doesn't think it. It roosts around the problem. It finds explanations, rationalizations, hopes. It clings to any possibility, however remote. Rather than confronting the unbearable truth, the Feng Shi didn't hypnotize the emperor. They didn't trick him with elaborate illusions. They simply told him what he desperately needed to hear, and his own mind did the rest. Years passed. Expeditions failed. Feng Shi came and went, some executed for failing, others rewarded for maintaining hope. The resources devoted to the search grew ever larger, and Qin Shi Huang grew older every morning. He would look in the mirror and see what he was fighting against. Lines appearing around his eyes, hair beginning to grey. The body that had once survived assassination attempts now aching in ways it hadn't before. Time was winning. The mystical approach wasn't working. The islands remained hidden. The immortals refused to share their secrets. The elixir of life remained tantalizingly out of reach. But the Feng Shi had one more option, one more path to immortality. If you couldn't find the elixir in distant paradise islands, perhaps you could make it yourself. Perhaps the secret wasn't geography, but chemistry. Perhaps, with the right ingredients and the right methods, you could manufacture eternal life in a laboratory. And so, Qin Shi Huang turned from exploration to experimentation. From seeking immortality to creating it, from dangerous hope to deadly certainty. The next phase of his obsession would be even more consuming. It would push the boundaries of ancient science. It would produce innovations that shaped Chinese chemistry for centuries, and it would slowly, invisibly, kill him. Somewhere in the Imperial Palace complex, in a building that officially did not exist, men were working with fire. They heated crucibles until the metal glowed white. They ground minerals into powder so fine it floated in the air like dust. They mixed substances that had never been combined before and watched, with a mixture of hope and terror, to see what would emerge. These were not priests performing rituals. These were not philosophers debating abstract concepts. These were, by the standards of their time, scientists, and they were trying to manufacture immortality. Welcome to the birth of Chinese alchemy. Welcome to humanity's first systematic attempt to conquer death through chemistry. Welcome to one of history's most ambitious and most tragic scientific programs. That the experiments conducted in these laboratories would shape Chinese medicine and chemistry for 2,000 years. They would produce genuine discoveries about the nature of matter and transformation. They would also kill the man who commissioned them. The shift from seeking immortality to creating it represented a fundamental change in approach. The Feng Shi, who promised magical islands, were offering a quest narrative. Go there, find the immortals, receive the secret. It was passive, in a sense. You were asking supernatural beings for a gift. Alchemy was different. Alchemy said, we can figure this out ourselves. The philosophy underlying Chinese alchemy was sophisticated, and, within its own framework, logical. The universe, according to ancient Chinese thought, was composed of fundamental principles that governed all transformation. If you could understand these principles, really understand them, at the deepest level you could manipulate them, including the transformation from mortal to immortal. This wasn't magic in the sense of arbitrary supernatural intervention. This was closer to what we would now call applied science. Observe the patterns of nature, identify the underlying rules, use those rules to achieve desired outcomes. The problem was that their understanding of the underlying rules was fundamentally wrong, but they didn't know that. And neither did the emperor. To understand what the alchemists were attempting, you need to understand the 5 elements theory. Ancient Chinese philosophy held that all matter was composed of 5 fundamental elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. These weren't just physical substances. They were principles of transformation, each flowing into the next in an eternal cycle, with feeds fire. Fire creates earth through ash. Earth contains metal. Metal carries water through condensation. Water nourishes wood. And the cycle continues forever. Everything in the universe could be understood through the interactions of these 5 elements: health and sickness, seasons and weather, emotions and thoughts, even the rise and fall of dynasties, and crucially, life and death. The alchemists believed that death occurred when the 5 elements within the body fell out of balance. The vital energies dissipated. The substances that composed the physical form lost their coherence and dissolved back into the universal flow. Immortality, therefore, was a matter of stabilization. If you could fix the elements in perfect, permanent balance, the body would never decay. If you could introduce substances that were themselves eternally stable, they would confer that stability to whoever consumed them. The question was, which substances possessed eternal stability? The alchemists had answers. Consider gold. Of all the metals known to the ancient world, gold was unique. It did not rust. It did not tarnish. It did not corrode. You could bury gold in the earth for 1,000 years, dig it up, and find it exactly as lustrous as the day it was buried. Gold was, in a very real sense, immortal. The logic seemed clear. If you could somehow introduce the essence of gold into the human body, you would transfer its incorruptibility to your own flesh. You would become like gold, eternal, unchanging, immune to the decay that claimed ordinary matter. The challenge was that you couldn't simply eat gold. Solid metal would pass through the body unchanged. You needed to transform gold into something the body could absorb. You needed to extract its immortal essence and make it consumable. This was the goal of external alchemy wedding in Chinese. Creating elixirs that captured the immortal properties of stable substances and delivered them into the human system. The alchemists worked for years on methods to dissolve gold, to combine it with other substances, to create pills and potions that carried its essence. They achieved some remarkable chemistry. They learned to use mercury's acids and complex heating processes to transform solid gold into substances that could actually be ingested. What they didn't understand was that these processes often created compounds far more dangerous than the original materials. But gold was expensive and difficult to work with. The alchemists had another substance they prized even more highly: cinnabar. If you've never heard of cinnabar, you've almost certainly Zenith. It's a bright red mineral, stunning in its color, found in volcanic regions throughout China. It was prized for pigments and decorative purposes, but to the alchemists, cinnabar was something far more significant. Cinnabar is mercury sulfide, a compound of mercury and sulfur. When you heat cinnabar, something remarkable happens. The bright red mineral transforms. It releases its mercury as a silvery liquid and its sulfur as a gas. And here's the part that fascinated the alchemists. If you capture that mercury and that sulfur and recombine them under the right conditions, you get cinnabar again, transformation and restoration, death and rebirth. The mineral seemed to demonstrate the very principle the alchemists were seeking. Mercury itself was even more impressive. This liquid metal, flowing like water but gleaming like silver, seemed to exist between states. It was neither fully solid nor fully liquid. It combined with other metals, transforming them. It moved as if alive. The alchemists called mercury living silver. They believed it contained a vital essence, a life force that could be transferred to the human body. They were partially right about mercury's remarkable properties. They were catastrophically wrong about its effects on human health. We need to pause here and acknowledge something deeply uncomfortable. These substances histamicary, lead, arsenic, sulfur are poisons. We know this now with absolute certainty. Mercury accumulates in the body and destroys the nervous system. Lead causes organ failure and cognitive damage. Arsenic is one of the most lethal substances known to humanity. The alchemists didn't know this, but they should have been able to figure it out. Because people were dying. The imperial laboratories employed hundreds of workers, servants who ground the minerals, assistants who monitored the furnaces, technicians who mixed the compounds, and at some point, these substances had to be tested. Historical records are deliberately vague on this point for reasons we'll discuss shortly. But we can piece together what happened from fragmentary accounts and later writings. Test subjects were used. We don't know if they were volunteers, prisoners, or servants who simply didn't have the power to refuse. We don't know how many there were. We don't know their names or their stories. We know they died. The symptoms would have been unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Tremors, confusion, bleeding gums, skin lesions, organ failure. The test subjects who consumed the experimental elixirs would have deteriorated over weeks or months, their bodies breaking down in ways that should have signaled danger. But here's the terrible logic that allowed the experiments to continue. When a test subject died, it didn't prove the elixir was poison. It proved that the test subject was impure, unworthy, spiritually inadequate to receive the gift of immortality. The elixir wasn't failing, the people were failing. And so the experiments continued, and more people died. Let me share with you an actual recipe from ancient alchemical texts. This comes from writings dated to roughly the period of Qing Shuang's reign, preserved through centuries of copying and transmission. Take cinnabar, 3 parts. Add realgar, 2 parts. Combine with sulfur, 1 part. Heat in a sealed vessel for 49 days, maintaining constant temperature. When the vessel is opened, the contents will have transformed into a purple-red powder. This is the elixir of the returning spirit. 1 dose will extend life by 12 years. 7 doses will grant immortality. Let's translate this into modern terms. Cinnabar is mercury sulfide. Realga is arsenic sulfide. Sulfur is pure elemental sulfur. When you heat these together in a sealed vessel, you create a complex mixture of mercury, arsenic, and sulfur compounds, some of them volatile, some of them in forms that are readily absorbed by the human body. This isn't an elixir of life. This is a sophisticated poison. 1 dose wouldn't extend life by 12 years. 1 dose would begin a process of mercury and arsenic accumulation that would slowly destroy the nervous system, the kidneys, the liver. 7 doses wouldn't grant immortality. 7 doses might very well be lethal, and this is just one recipe among hundreds. The alchemical literature of ancient China contains countless variations, each promising eternal life, each combining toxic substances in different proportions. The men who created these recipes weren't trying to murder people. They genuinely believed they were discovering the secrets of immortality. They were working within a theoretical framework that seemed internally consistent. They were, by the standards of their time, doing science. They were also creating poisons and feeding them to human beings. At some point, Qin Shi Huang stopped relying solely on test subjects. The emperor began taking the elixirs himself. We don't know exactly when this started. The historical records are fragmentary and often contradictory. But multiple sources agree that in the final years of his life, Qin Shi Huang was regularly consuming substances created by his alchemists. The logic, from his perspective, would have been compelling. He had already spent years sending expeditions to find immortals. He had invested enormous resources in alchemical research. If the elixirs worked, he needed to start taking them soon. He was already in his late 40s, ancient by the standards of the time. Every day he delude was a day closer to death. And there was another factor. The alchemists were telling him what he wanted to hear. Remember, failure in Qin Shi Huang's court often meant death. If an alchemist admitted that his elixir was poison, he would be executed. If he insisted that his elixir was the key to immortality and the emperor just needed to take it in larger doses, he might survive another day. The incentive structure guaranteed that the emperor would receive only positive reports. Every experiment was a success. Every elixir was promising. Every failure was due to impure ingredients, insufficient doses, or spiritual inadequacy of the test subjects. So the emperor kept taking the pills. Mercury accumulated in his tissues. His nervous system slowly deteriorated. The very substances he consumed to escape death were killing him cell by cell. And he had no idea the secrecy surrounding these experiments was absolute. To reveal that an imperial elixir had failed was treason. To suggest that the quest for immortality might be impossible was heresy. To record the deaths of tests, subjects, or the negative effects of the pills was to invite execution. This is why our knowledge of this period is so fragmentary. The historical records were systematically sanitized. The failures were erased. The deaths were unrecorded. What we know mostly from later scholars who pieced together hints and rumors, or from texts that survived the various book burnings and library destructions that punctuate Chinese history. But we know enough to understand the tragedy. The most powerful man in the world, with access to the greatest minds and resources of his age, was slowly poisoning himself. and no one around him could tell him the truth, because telling him the truth would mean death. Before we leave this chapter, we need to acknowledge something important. Qin Shi Huang was not unique. The obsession with alchemical immortality would continue for centuries after his death. Emperor after emperor would consume mercury elixirs. Many of them died from it. One scholar has estimated that at least 6 Chinese emperors died definitively from elixir poisoning, with several more as likely candidates. And this wasn't just a Chinese phenomenon. Thousands of miles to the west, in the Mediterranean world and later in medieval Europe, alchemists pursued nearly identical goals with nearly identical methods. They sought the philosopher's stone, which could transmute base metals into gold. They sought the elixir of life, which could grant immortality, and they used many of the same substances. Mercury was as central to European alchemy as to Chinese. So were sulfur, arsenic, antimony, and lead. European alchemists heated, distilled, and combined these materials in endless variations. Convinced that the right formula would unlock the secrets of eternal life, they poised themselves too. The parallel development is remarkable. 2 civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, with no significant contact, arrived at the same desperate solution to the same desperate problem. They identified the same immortal substances. They developed similar techniques for processing. Then they made similar mistakes. Perhaps this tells us something about human nature. When faced with death, we reach for the same solutions regardless of culture or geography. We look for substances that don't decay and assume they can prevent our own decay. We see transformation in nature and believe we can transform ourselves. We poison ourselves with hope. The laboratories continued their work. The alchemists continued their experiments. The emperor continued swallowing their creations, and time continued to pass. Qin Shi Huang was now in his late 40s. By the standards of ancient China, he was already old. Most people didn't survive past 40. He had outlived many of his contemporaries through a combination of wealth, privilege, and access to the best physicians of his age. But something was wrong. He was experiencing symptoms that no physician could explain. Tremors in his hands, difficulty concentrating, moods that swung from rage to despair and back again, sleeplessness that kept him wandering through his palaces at night. His physicians prescribed more elixirs. The alchemists refined their formulas. Everyone assured him that the path to immortality was working, that these symptoms were merely the body adjusting to its transformation, that eternal life was near. The mercury continued to accumulate. But the emperor had another plan running parallel to his alchemical experiments. Even as he pursued immortality, some part of him must have acknowledged the possibility of failure. Some part of him was preparing for what would happen if death won after all. He was building a tomb, not just any tomb, the largest, most elaborate burial complex the world had ever seen. An underground palace filled with rivers of mercury, guarded by an army of terracotta soldiers designed to give him a kingdom in death that matched his kingdom in life. The tomb was a backup plan, a hedge against the failure of immortality, but it was also something more. It was a monument to the very fear that drove him, a declaration that if he couldn't escape death, he would at least control what came after, and it would cost more lives than the alchemical experiments ever did. Beneath a mountain in central China, there is a palace no living person has ever seen it. has been there for over 2,000 years, sealed, silent, waiting. The greatest archaeologists in the world know exactly where it is. They have mapped its outlines with ground-penetrating radar. They've analyzed the soil around it. They've confirmed details that were once dismissed as legend, and they refuse to open it. Not because they lack the technology, not because they lack the funding, not because they lack the curiosity. They refuse because what's inside might be too dangerous to disturb. Welcome to the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the largest mausoleum ever constructed. A monument so ambitious it took nearly 40 years to build. A burial complex so vast it contains an entire army of stone soldiers, rivers of liquid poison, and secrets we may never fully understand. This is the story of a man who prepared for death more elaborately than anyone in human history, while simultaneously refusing to accept that death would ever claim him. The construction began in 246 BCE. Qin Shi Huang was 13 years old. Think about that for a moment. A teenage boy, newly crowned as King of Qin, gave orders to begin building his own tomb. Before he had conquered a single rival kingdom, before he had unified China, before he had accomplished anything that would earn him a place in history, he was already planning for his death. This might seem morbid by modern standards. It was perfectly normal for ancient Chinese royalty. Kings were expected to prepare elaborate burials for themselves. The afterlife required proper accommodation, and construction took time. Starting early wasn't pessimism. It was prudent planning. But what Qin Shi Huang planned was anything but normal. From the very beginning, the scope was unprecedented. He didn't want a tomb. He didn't want a mausoleum. He wanted an underground kingdom. He wanted to take everything. With him, the workforce assembled for this project defies modern comprehension. 700,000 laborers. Let that number sink in. In an age before machinery, before power tools, before any technology more sophisticated than bronze implements and human muscle, 700,000 people were conscripted to build one man's burial site. That's roughly equivalent to the entire population of San Francisco today. Every man, woman, and child working on a single construction project. Except these weren't volunteers earning wages. These were conscripts, many of them prisoners or peasants seized from their villages and forced into service. They dug into the earth, excavating millions of tons of soil. They carved chambers into bedrock. They constructed walls and ceilings reinforced to withstand the weight of the mountain above. They worked in shifts around the clock for decades, in conditions we can only imagine. Many of them never left. The historical records are clear on this point. Workers who died during construction were often buried where they fell. The tomb complex itself is partly built on the bones of those who created it. But even those who survived the construction faced a terrible choice at the AE. The tomb was designed as a mirror of the empire above. Everything Qin Shi Huang had conquered, everything he had built, everything he possessed, he wanted it replicated underground for eternity. The main burial chamber was constructed as an underground palace, complete with living quarters, audience halls, and treasure rooms. The walls were reinforced with bronze. The ceilings were painted with elaborate depictions of the night sky constellations and celestial bodies, a permanent heaven for the eternal emperor. But the most extraordinary feature was the rivers. According to Sima Qian, the great historian, who wrote the definitive account of Qin Shi Huang's life about a century after his death. The burial chamber contained mechanical rivers of liquid mercury, designed to represent the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, the two great waterways that defined the Chinese landscape. Mercury flowing eternally through channels carved in the chamber floor. Mercury representing water but never evaporating, never drying up, never changing. A permanent, incorruptible substitute for the rivers that sustained the empire above. For 2,000 years, historians debated whether this description was literal or metaphorical. Was Sima Qian recording fact or embellishing legend? Could the ancient Chinese really have assembled enough mercury to create flowing rivers? In the 1980s, Chinese scientists tested the soil around the tomb. The mercury levels were 100 times higher than normal. Sima Qian was telling the truth. The rivers of mercury served multiple purposes. First, they fulfilled the symbolic requirement of replicating the empire. The Yellow and Yangtze rivers were essential to China's identity at agriculture. Its trade, its very survival depended on these waterways. An emperor without rivers was no emperor at all. Second, mercury was believed to have preservative properties. We've already discussed the role of mercury in alchemical immortality experiments. The same logic applied to the tomb. Mercury would help preserve the emperor's body, preventing decay, maintaining him in a state suitable for eternal existence. Third, and perhaps most practically, mercury is extremely toxic. Any tomb robber who managed to breach the outer chambers and approach the burial site would be entering a space saturated with mercury vapor. They might not notice anything at first. Mercury vapor is invisible and nearly odorless. But within hours, they would begin to sicken. Within days, they would be dead. The rivers of mercury weren't just symbolic, they were a security system. But the murky rivers were only one layer of protection. Sima Qian describes crossbow traps installed throughout the tomb complex. These weren't simple tripwire mechanisms. They were sophisticated automated weapons, designed to trigger when intruders entered specific chambers, firing bolts that would remain lethal for centuries. Have any of these traps been confirmed? We don't know. The main burial chamber remains sealed. But the Chinese had developed crossbow technology far beyond anything in the Western world at this time. Repeating crossbows that could fire multiple bolts, trigger mechanisms of remarkable precision. The technology certainly existed. Whether the traps are still functional after 2,000 years is anyone's guess. But Chinese archaeologists aren't. Eager to find out through trial and error. And then there are the soldiers. In 1974, farmers digging a well near the tomb complex made one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. They broke through into an underground chamber and found themselves face to face with an army. The terracotta Army. 8,000 life-size clay soldiers, each one individually crafted, each face unique, each expression different. Infantry, and archers, cavalry and charioteers, generals and common soldiers, all standing in battle formation, all facing east, all ready to defend their emperor for eternity. The detail is staggering. Their armor is accurate down to individual rivets. Their hairstyles reflect their rank and region of origin. Their weapons real, weapons of bronze, still sharp after 2 millennia, were mass-produced, using assembly line techniques that wouldn't be reinvented in the West. for another 2,000 years. This army wasn't guarding the tomb symbolically. In the belief system of the time, these soldiers would literally serve the emperor in the afterlife. They would fight his battles. They would protect his palace. They would enforce his will in the world of the dead. And they were only part of the collection. Separate pits contained terracotta officials, terracotta acrobats, terracotta musicians, bronze chariots and horses, half life-size, but perfectly detailed. Suits of stone armor, too heavy to ever wear, created purely for burial. Chin. Shuang was taking his entire court with him. His entire army. His entire empire. Everything except the one thing he actually wanted. More time. Here is the paradox at the heart of this tomb. While these hundreds of thousands of workers carved an eternal kingdom underground, while these terracotta soldiers were molded and fired, while these rivers of mercury were assembled and set, flowing, the emperor was simultaneously pursuing immortality with desperate intensity.